There have been predictions of some kind of revolution or mass uprising in South Africa for economic reasons for at least a decade, partly because so many young people are not able to work. There are no jobs for them. So then, where do we start with the conversation? In essence, it's a conversation around the level of risk and this happening again and how we change it. Bheki Mahlobo is an analyst at the Center for Risk Analyst. Professor Willie Chinyamurindi is a professor at the Department of Business Management at the University of Fort Hare. He studied youth unemployment, and Professor Lawrence Hamilton is the Newton Research Professor in Political Theory at the Universities of the Witwatersrand and of Cambridge. Good evening to you all. Bheki Mahlobo, let me just start with you. Was it possible to predict that this would happen? Was it possible to know in advance that this kind of violence, this kind of civil unrest would happen?
Yes, good evening to you, Stefan, and good evening to your viewers. Yes, it was possible to anticipate what has led to the violent looting that we've seen in recent week. In fact, that's exactly what we've been doing at the Center for Risk Analysis. And it's mainly due to the relation in which we see in socio-economic standards as well as living standards of average South Africans, as well as political trends that we see in the country. And this is the trend that we see over the past 10 years. We've seen a shift in the way of thinking from within the ANC, and that impacts the policies implemented by the ruling government, which later impacts the economic performance of the country. And what we've seen over the past 10 years is hostile policies implemented by the ruling government, which results in stagnant economic growth and a youth unemployment rate of 75% and 11.4 million people unemployed under the expanded definition. And the reason why I emphasize on the expanded definition is that it includes people that have given up employment. And that's a dangerous trend that we've been noticing over the past 10 years, is that a great proportion of South Africans are giving up the aspirations of employment in the country, largely due to employment opportunities being in a great decline. That means people do not have, average South Africans do not have incomes to sustain themselves and their families. And this fans the flames of desperation and lawlessness in the country, in which we have seen today. And this is not the first time that we're seeing this. This happens on a daily occasion in the South African context. In fact, from the period 2007 to where we find ourselves today, according to SAP's data, there's been an increase of 400% of violent protests in the country.
Sure. Professor Chinyamurindi, you actually have been researching unemployment among young people and the impact on them. Now, the numbers tell us how bad it is, over 70%, as Bheki Mahlobo just pointed out. But there's a much bigger story around how young people feel when they cannot work, when they're kept outside of the economy.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I think the Bheki puts it very nicely. The expanded definition becomes important because within the cohort of the expanded definition are all these young people who are coming out of institutions of higher learning, technical and vocational education training, colleges, and you name the wide array of capacity building initiatives that we have in the country, and who literally are giving up because one would think they would be at a better stage because they have the tools, as per se, of the trade in terms of that paper and that qualification. Yet on the ground, the reality is somewhat different. And this somewhat leads to a frustration, aggression type of behavior where, and we don't justify it, but where young people have been promised that this is the route and this is the key for them to be, sole designers of their own destiny, if you like. And all of a sudden, the reality on the ground does not match to these promises. And you would also factor in trigger events that have happened, which we cannot ignore, the political scenarios and tensions that were leading up to this. But this has been coming as part of the breakdown of our skills capacity enhancing initiatives in the country, where we have a lot of young people who are frustrated out there.
Professor Hamilton, there's actually been a question that has been asked in some cases before. Let me put it another way. I remember Zwelinzima Vavi at Kasatu, as he then was, 11 years ago, saying the day will come when poor people go over the walls of the rich. The walls won't be high enough. I remember Moeletsi and Bheki, I'm sure you remember him saying that South Africa is ripe for a Tunisian-style revolution. I think he said 2024 would be the year it would happen. And we remember what happened in those Tunisian-style revolutions. They were driven by young people who were angry and frustrated. I suppose, to put it another way, why hasn't it happened here before?
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks for inviting me on, and hi to all the viewers. It's a really good question. I wrote a book that came out in 2014, which basically asked that question as to why it hadn't happened and when it might, frankly. A lot of the conditions have already been described really well. And I think that the moral psychology or political psychology that's just been described is really, really important, in the sense that it's difficult for people in the middle classes who have stable positions in society to often understand the horizons of people that will go out and loot in the way that we've seen, and the kind of violence that has been expressed. But this is linked to a completely different horizon of possibility that a lot of young people who've been unemployed, to the extent that they've been unemployed, have. Linked to, of course, conditions under COVID, linked to, recent announcements that have made those even more dire. People's aspirations, people's horizons of opportunity, especially in the younger age groups, are very, very short. And so there's very little capacity, or there's very little conditions on the ground in which they will be enabled to plan their lives and make rational decisions in the way that many would expect. But I do want to pick up on one point. Although the conditions have been around for a long, long time, it's very difficult in politics to be able to predict these matters. So I would contest in some way the idea that we've been predicting this kind of thing. And to this, I'd want to point to the fact that, it's not just a matter of these looters. Sorry about that. It's not just a matter of a set of looters. It's very important to see that these sorts of events require a trigger event. And we shouldn't lay to one side the very important and horrific use and abuse of poor, disabled, unemployed, hopeless people by what is seemingly a group of Zuma allies. We'll wait and see, of course, but Zuma allies to generate massive economic disruption, if not more. The idea that we could have predicted this is, I think, to say too much and to claim too much. We could have said, and many did say, and they didn't say it loud enough, that of course, under these sorts of conditions where we would successfully jail Zuma, and rightly so, then the trigger event may be that. But that's as much as one could say.
We're going to continue with this conversation in a moment. Professor Lawrence Hamilton, Professor Willie Chinyamurindi, and Bheki Mahlobo, the analyst. Stay with us here on Newsfeed. Really important conversation. Don't forget the President speaking 8:30 tonight. And how do we stop it from happening again? Bheki Mahlobo is an analyst at the Center for Risk Analysis. Professor Willie Chinyamurindi is a professor in the Department of Business Management at the University of Fort Hare. Professor Lawrence Hamilton is the Newton Research Professor in Political Theory, both at the Cambridge University and at Wits University. Welcome back to all three of you. Bheki, if I may just come back to you. The question, of course, is, if we've seen what happened, if the conditions on the ground don't change, there's a huge risk that all of this could happen again. It just needs another trigger event.
Exactly. And that's exactly if the core issues are not addressed, Stephen. The core issues being that of the youth unemployment rate that we've just basically spoken about, as well as that of education levels, of which only 5% of young South Africans at high school pass matric with a maths pass rate of 50%. That's looking at the original grade 1 in class in 2001, following all the way until grade 12. If those issues, as well as that of the economy, the only way to prevent this from occurring in later years in the South African context is to simply grow the South African economy to levels of about 3 to 5% of GDP. In the absence of that, unfortunately, we're going to see more spikes in future, which will see more violent protests occurring in South Africa.
Professor Chinyamurindi, I mean, the thing is there, I mean, that's enough to make one lose hope, because if you can only do it through education, it takes a long time. You're looking at 20 years to change the conditions on the ground. There must be something we can do. I mean, obviously, a change in economic policy, and I've lost count of the number of times I've had conversations around economic policy in this country.
Well, I'll tell you what we don't need, Stephen. We don't need another job summit. We don't need more talk shops about talking about the situation and the challenges. I think we need to be also creative around the challenges that face us. And one such conversation which is happening particularly within the institutions of higher learning is creating these ideas of entrepreneurial societies. The irony, Stephen, is that a lot of entrepreneurs are going to bed very concerned, heightened anxiety around the state of being and their contribution towards this. So, I was pushing a month ago for more entrepreneurial opportunities being created for young people. I think one of the concerns we have is now creating the business confidence and some form of assurance of security that it is safe to be an entrepreneur in South Africa without all these, given all these challenges that we've had. And then we also need to not group our youths as one, uniquely similar cohort. There are different types of variants that exist amongst our young people. And that understanding really needs to be put in place, because the needs would differ, the aspirations would differ. And as Bheki was saying, just a trigger away, but I think we need more creative solutions, the idea of more scenarios other than what we are currently doing, to say how do we then address also the challenges of the social inequality that is so prevalent in our society, without also not wanting to sound politically incorrect about the situation. Really, at the heart of it is a social issue that has been allowed to continue on and on and on. And I think this is a wake-up call.
Professor Chinyamurindi, if I can just stay with you for a minute. I mean, it's easy to get caught up in the number and think, well, we will never change it. But if you create one job, that creates, an income for perhaps 9, 10, 11 people. That changes a lot of lives, which in themselves increases the chances of people in that family of having a job.
And so what I was thinking about, Stephen, is how do I stand in front of my next class to my students to say, Prof, you're busy encouraging us to think entrepreneurship, but here are the networks around which entrepreneurs operate within. They are destroyed. But what also has been destroyed is not only these networks, but young people actually seeing the opportunities that can come out of such networks. And the first port of call, let's address the disorder that is happening now. Let's have the resumption of law and order, clear demarcations of who's in charge, respect of property. And then once we have that, then I really would argue for a rethink even in the way we are churning out our graduates into this market that is somewhat complex and very difficult to operate within after this event.
Professor Hamilton, I've often wondered if one of the strengths of our society, they're sort of related strengths, is our transparency and our freedom of expression. And what I mean by that is that people are allowed to speak if they're angry, and they do, even though, there's such a thing as paid Twitter. You can still see what is, proper, honest, organic statements of frustration. You can, I suppose, listen to talk radio, perhaps, which is where people complain, but you can look at all sorts of things. And the reason that that's important is that it sends signals to the political leaders that there's a problem developing here, for example. Does that actually work as a safety valve, or am I overplaying it?
I think you're overplaying it, Stephen, to be honest. It does have a very vital role, both as an accountability structure and as just a basic information source for government, so that there's a a two-way movement of information around needs and interests and conditions on the ground. But what's so much more important is a strong and firm accountability structure. So just to take a step back and answer your question, what has really come to the fore in the last week has been the extent to which our state is failing us in so many ways. So while I agree with my co-commentators around entrepreneurialism and around the question of youth unemployment and inequality and poverty, of course, what is, I think, really central, and there's a horrible irony in this, is that the state has been denuded of its capacity along four main levels. The one is simple security, the maintenance of law and order. And the state for the last 9-10 years, especially under the Zuma era, has been denuded of that capacity. It has been denuded of the capacity to meet another of its main functions, and that is to ensure the basic well-being of its citizenry. And secondly, to properly regulate the market when the market fails, or when we start off from conditions of massive inequality based upon in our case, our terrible racialized history and racialized inequality. And finally, to deliver on public goods that the market cannot deliver on. And unfortunately, what we see coming together is the failure on all of those four fronts as regards our state. And that is to do with a combination of the slow and very insidious undermining of the capacity of the state to deliver at those levels. And the horrible and terrible irony of this is, of course, that it's a consequence of the Zuma era. And the trigger is then the trigger, supposedly, allegedly, by Zuma allies. So while you're right that we live, unlike in various parts of the world, in a country of great freedom of information and great freedom of association, and those things should be lauded and safeguarded, they are by no means the central and important matters as regards ensuring our well-being as citizens and ensuring our security as citizens and ensuring the possibility for us to live and lead the kinds of lives that we would like to live and lead.
Professor Hamilton, if I can just stay with you for another moment. You made a point about a sort of trigger event and how important a trigger event is, which is that you can, if I understood you correctly, you can have these conditions on the ground, which we do, but you still do need a trigger event. In this case, I think that most people believe that, and certainly it seems that many people believe it's around the arrest of former President Jacob Zuma. But to follow on from the point you're making, there will be other people in our society, perhaps in the future, if the conditions on the ground don't change significantly, the risk of trigger events will always be there because there'll be other people who have an agenda. There'll be other people who need to escape the rule of law or other people who benefit from it in some way. And there'll be a deliberate use of trigger events. They'll deliberately start trigger events is what I'm trying to say. If it's not Zuma, it could be someone else in the future.
Absolutely. And that is the very serious risk that lots of people have been talking about. To be clear, this is, I hope I'm not proven wrong about this, but this is not, in my mind, a revolution. So in the normal ways in which revolutions have occurred and have been studied and analyzed, normally it's not just a matter of a trigger event. Normally it's a matter of there being a very coherent leadership that brings together and ultimately will use the condition of immiserated and miserable masses, basically, to further the interests of the revolutionary moment. So, yes, you could have actually, under current conditions, a way more serious kind of trigger event, which is a real revolution. This is not, at least as things stand, and at least as much as we know, this is not that. But it could easily be something like that under these sorts of conditions. All you would need is someone like, for example, Julius Malema, to decide that they weren't going to play the parliamentary game and to play the sort of revolutionary card.
Bheki Mahlobo, I mean, all of this is really, sends a strong lesson to government, to the political class. Let me use a wider definition, to the political class, to make changes. Is it possible to know if they're listening? Political elites like the situation as it is, because the situation it is often got them to where they are.
There was a time, in fact, where South Africa actually grew the economy. This was in the early years of South Africa's democracy, from 1994 to 2007, under the leadership of Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki. We did see a doubling of employment levels, as well as indicators such as that of access to service delivery, water and electricity, increasing by levels of 200%. So it is possible that we can change the trajectory that we're currently on. All it requires is a shift in the mindset of the ANC from hostile policies which threaten fixed investment levels in the country, such as that of expropriation of property without compensation, as well as that of the National Health Insurance Scheme. Those policies are detrimental to the South African economy and will negatively impact the average South African, particularly that is economically disadvantaged, as well as that of empowerment policies which have been a tax on investment, as well as that of not actually benefiting the economically disadvantaged South African. It is possible for us to see those growth levels. Unfortunately, as we currently see it, the current administration under Ramaphosa is not reformist in mindset, and that we can see this with the example of this week with the deflection of these 12 officials. We from the Center for Risk Analysis, although we do suspect there's some involvement in terms of the incitement of violence, but we don't think this is largely organized by 12 individuals. This was an organic matter, which the circumstances that we have already discussed throughout this discussion led to where we currently are. And what we're seeing from the Ramaphosa administration is that the use of these 12 individuals stating that they are the organizers of the violent looting that we've seen this week is deflection from the pressure of them. They are deflecting from the core issues that we have discussed so far, and that does not bode well for what we see in the future for South Africa. It tells us they are completely reluctant at implementing the fundamental reforms that will move South Africa from where we currently are and to emulate what we see in other emerging markets.
Bheki Mahlobo, analyst at Center for Risk Analysis. I really do appreciate the time. Professor Willie Chinyamurindi, a professor at the Department for Business Management at the University of Fort Hare. Thank you, sir. And Professor Lawrence Hamilton, Newton Research Professor in Political Theory, both at the University of Cambridge and Wits University. I really do appreciate the time. Thank you very much indeed.